So the recording will start now, and with that I will hand over to Maria.
Okay.
Over to you.
Yep, hello. Thank you very much for that, David. Right, yep. Okay, so hopefully you can all see that screen now of mine. Does that look kind of okay for everybody? Yep, okay. So, yep, sorry, I'm just going to go back there. Okay, so hello everybody, and welcome to this talk about the Geranium genus, which I hope you're going to enjoy. I've been finding out more about this genus during lockdown, so basically I'm sharing what I've learned with you today, and that's the kind of level that I'm pitching this at. There are about 30 species that you might find growing wild in Britain, but only about a dozen of those are common. One thing that complicates matters is that many geranium species and varieties are grown in gardens and can escape, so this adds to the interest or the complexity of the group. So let's start off with what's distinctive about these plants. The key thing here is their mechanism for seed dispersal. The fruit capsule is made up of 5 mericarps, and that is one of the terms that you need to get to know. Each contains one seed and has a beak, and these mericarps are joined by their beaks to a column which is produced from the center of the old flower. The mericarps spring from the column when they're ripe, and that explosively flings the seed some distance away. So just to repeat, we use the word mericarp when we've got a fruit which splits up into one-seeded portions. And in this genus, the beaks of the mericarps are just slightly curved or form a loose spiral. The common name for these plants is cranesbill, and that comes from the shape of the long column, and it is reasonable to say that it does look rather like the bill of a crane. So here's an illustration to help you to imagine that. The other thing these plants all have in common is their palmately lobed leaves, like fingers sticking out from a palm. So think of a maple leaf as a good example of this. Now, the Geranium genus is a genus within the Geraniaceae family, and there's already been a comment by one of the attendees about Pelargonium. I'm going to point out at the beginning that the plants people often call geraniums are in a separate genus, Pelargonium. These are woody at the base, and they have flowers with bilateral symmetry, which means one side's a mirror image of the other, while the cranesbills have radially symmetrical flowers. Also in Pelargonium, the upper sepals have a spur, which, as you can see in the photo on the right-hand side, is fused to the flower stalk. You will probably be familiar with some of these garden pelargoniums, and some do persist for a while when they're thrown out by a gardener. But in this talk, we're going to put the pelargoniums to one side and focus on the genus Geranium. We're also not going to tackle the other main genus in this family, Erodium, the stalkspills, with their pinnately lobed leaves and tightly spiraled mericarp beaks. So in his flora, Stace divides the Geranium genus into 3 subgenera, and that's quite a useful place to start in working your way through the genus. So these subgenera are Geranium, Robertium, and Erodioidea. And to distinguish them, you have to look at the shape of the petals and also at the shape of the base of the mericarps. You need to look for whether the petal narrows into a base into a claw at the base. So here's a diagram on the left showing you petals with and without a claw. And the other diagram shows you a mature geranium fruit, and you can see the mericarps and where you would look to see the shape of the base. I've put the differences into a table. So in the subgenus Geranium, the petals don't have a claw and the mericarps are rounded at the base. In Robertium, the petals do have a distinct claw, but the mericarps are again rounded at the base. And in Erodioidea, the petals don't have a claw, but this time the mericarps are pointed at the base. And in addition, in this group, the beak of the mericarp twists into a loose spiral when it's ripe. So that's how you can tell the 3 subgenera apart, and that can narrow down the options when you're trying to identify a plant. Now, Stace 4 describes 30 geranium plants and says that about a dozen more have been reported as escapes from time to time. I'm not going to try and cover them all in detail, although that would be really interesting because I would get cut off before reaching the end. So we're going to content ourselves with looking particularly closely at the more common species and just discussing the others, but a bit more briefly. However, I hope there will be something of interest to all of you in this. I'm going to begin giving you an overview by very quickly showing you 3 slides which cover all the plants which Stace 4 describes, but we're not going to dwell on these now. So it's just to give you a bit of a sense about, how the different plants are divided up. So these are the ones in the Geranium subgenus. In the Robertium subgenus, we have these. And then finally, we have the plants in the Rhodioidea subgenus, and there's a more manageable, just 2 of those. The books I use most for this presentation will probably be familiar to you, but I just thought it might be useful, particularly for beginners, to get a bit of a sense about which are useful books. Francis Rose's The Wildflower Key is probably the best starting point for new botanists, but I also like the Collins Wildflower Guide by David Streeter et al. Stace, now on edition 4, is a classic book for botanists, and John Poland's Vegetative Key is great too. There's a new edition now, although I don't have that yet. Richard Jermy's Plant Crib is useful, and that's available online, and I sometimes use Blamey Fitter and Fitter's Wildflowers book as well. I've used a couple of local flora too, you can see those in the middle there, and I've had a look at Richard Mabey's Flora Britannica. Most of the images I've used in this talk are from Wikimedia Commons, so thanks to those who've shared their work there, and each is credited below the relevant photo. So we're going to start off now with the key features we need for identification. We'll start with flower features, though quite a few species can be identified in the vegetative state. So we're looking in terms of flowers at the size of the flowers. Are they small, about 0.5 centimetre across, medium-sized, 1 to 2 centimetres across, or larger than that? The colour of the petals, so particularly whether they're purplish, pinkish, or bluish. Whether the petals are notched or not, and if that notch is deep or shallow. Whether the flower's flat or a deeper cup shape. Whether the flowers are single or in pairs. Whether the flower stalks are particularly long, and what the stamens are like. Do they all have anthers, and how long are the stamens compared to the sepals? In terms of fruits and leaves and the rest of the plant, these are the key features. So we're looking at whether the mericarps are hairy or not, and whether they're ridged or smooth. Whether the fruit stalk is bent down. The shape and the size of the leaves is very useful. And then also another very useful feature is whether all about the plant's hairs, whether the plant's hairy or not, and what any hairs are like. So do they have glands on the end, which look like little blobs? Do they stick out, lie flat, or curl back? And are they all the same length? Whether the plant's an annual, a biennial, or perennial, for how long it lives. Whether there's any swelling at the nodes, there's one particular species where that's worth looking for, and whether the stems are abruptly bent. And again, there's one species when that's a distinctive feature. If you can describe all these features, you really can be pretty confident about identifying your geranium. So the next slide is just a generic flower with the main parts labelled. And I've put that in because I know we've got a few beginners in the audience and I want them to kind of feel part of things as well. So just very quickly, we've got the petal, we've got the notch that you might see in the petal, we've got the female part, the stigma that catches the pollen, the ovary made up of the 5 mericarps in geranium. We've got the male part, the stamen with the anther at the top where the pollen comes from, and the stalk called the filament. Then we've got the sepal, and then we've got the flower stalk, which is known as peduncle, but we'll stick to flower stalk here. Okay, so just so people are familiar with that, but there's not going to be a lot of technical vocabulary, so don't worry too much about that. So now we're going to go back to that geranium subgenus. Remember, that's petals with no claw and mericarps with rounded bases. The 3 most common ones are Geranium pratense, meadow cranesbill, Geranium rotundifolium, round-leaved cranesbill, and Geranium dissectum, cut-leaved cranesbill. And we're going to start off by looking at those 3. So here we have Geranium pratense, meadow cranesbill. It's much larger than the other 2. It's a perennial, so it lasts for years, and it can grow up to about 1 metre high. It's stickily hairy because of its glandular hairs. The lower leaves are really deeply lobed, and there's a nice picture of that on the right here. They've got 7 to 9 lobes, and they're cut almost to the base. On each lobe, there are sharp, narrow teeth, and again, that's distinctive. John Poland in the Vegetative Key tells us that each tooth has a purple hydophode gland, which is a gland that exudes water. That's quite interesting, although it's a feature found throughout the cranesbill, so it won't actually help with identification, but it's quite an interesting thing to look for. The large flowers come in pairs and they're saucer shaped, so they're fairly shallow. The petals are violet to sky blue in colour with paler veins, and the fact that they're not notched is worth remembering because there's a couple of other similar species where they are. The mericarps are hairy, and another distinctive feature is that the stalk is usually bent down when the plant is fruiting. Meadow cranesbill is a plant of grassland. It is a native, but it's also been cultivated, and then these populations have naturalised. So Rodney Burton in the last London Flora only thought it was native in the grassland near the Thames above London, and that elsewhere it was a garden escape. And this ability to fling its seed some distance away obviously helps with its spread. Trevor James in the Hertfordshire Flora, which is more recent, describes an interesting history which seems to be mirrored in the national picture. By the 19th century, this plant was becoming scarce in hay meadows due to changes in farming practices. And by the 1960s, in Hertfordshire, it had almost completely disappeared. It only survived on calcareous chalky road verges and only coped there as long as they weren't sprayed or salted. But it then began to increase again, and it suddenly reappears at sites. I'm speculating that that represents new garden escapes rather than a spread of the native plant, although I'm not sure about that. There are many cultivars and hybrids of meadow cranesbill, and there are also several similar garden species which may escape. So this can make identification more difficult, and I'll point out some things that may help as we go along. I'm now showing the first of the distribution maps for this talk. They come from the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, who've kindly given me permission to use them here, and I recommend exploring their site. I've given you the address at the top there, and then the other site that's worth exploring as far as distribution is concerned is the Biological Records Centre's online atlas, and that's got really helpful summaries. The last National Plant Atlas dates from 2000, so we're now looking forward to Atlas 2020 to see how things have changed in the last 20 years. And when I wrote that, I was like thinking, how did those 20 years pass so quickly? But they have. So we're looking now forward to Atlas 2020, and Mark Spencer, our London recorder and a really eminent botanist, has been heavily involved both in this project and in the planned new London Flora. So we're going to find out more about that in his talk on the 3rd of September. So I urge you to book for that if you haven't done that already. So here on this map, it shows you that meadow cranesbill is widespread, apart from in the far north, and there's not so many records in Ireland either. The second common plant in this subgenus is Geranium rotundifolium, round-leaved cranesbill. It's also a very hairy plant, but it's much smaller and it's an annual. Its leaves are long-stalked and rounded, which gives it its name, and they're cut about halfway into a few blunt lobes. Look between the lobes and you see what's called the sinus, and in this particular plant, those sinuses are often red. Also look at the leaf stalks, because there you will see abundant red-tipped glandular hairs. The pink flowers are medium in size, and as in meadow cranesbill, the petals aren't notched. If you look at the mericarps, you'll find they're downy and rather wrinkled. Now, you generally won't need to see the features of the mericarps to identify the common species, but it's a good habit to get into looking at them, as it does help in distinguishing some of the less common ones. You'll definitely need a hand lens for this. Round-leaved cranesbill is a native plant, which, as you can see from the map, is particularly common in southeastern England. It likes dry habitats and stony ground. Trevor James found that in Hertfordshire it was increasing, and he speculated that it might have begun to spread on railway ballast during the Second World War, when there was less weed killing. On a national scale, it's noticeably increased since the early 1960s, and there's an idea that it may be spreading northwards. There were few records in the last London Flora, which was based on surveys, as people probably know, were done in the 1960s and early 70s, and I suspect it will be considerably commoner in the forthcoming one. Our third common plant in this subgenus is Geranium dissectum, cut-leaved cranesbill. Here I'm showing you an example from my own herbarium, not because it's a perfect example, but just because it's a good reminder that making your own herbarium of common plants is a really good learning tool. Cut-leaved cranesbill is another hairy annual, but as its name suggests, its leaves are divided almost to the base into narrow lobes, which are then lobed again. So you end up with these really narrow linear lobes. The flowers are a bit smaller than those of round-leaved cranesbill, and this time the petals are notched, so look out for that. It's got many glandular hairs, and this time the mericarps are hairy too. It's another very common plant of waste and grassy places, but this time it's not a native, but an archaeophyte, which means it's been in Britain since at least the medieval period. It may be particularly successful because it can tolerate fertilizers and pollutants and disturbance, and it's been recorded from many more squares since the 1960s, so it seems to be becoming more abundant. So those are the first three plants for beginners to get to grips with in this subgenus. We're now going to turn to the other plants in this group, and I'm going to point out the main identifying features. We're going to start with those you're fairly likely to find as you're out botanizing, as long as COVID-19 allows you, of course. And these are the plants found in the Wildflower Key and or Collins Wildflower Guide. The perennial Geranium endressii French cranesbill has large salmon pink petals and leaves with 5 broad lobes. There are glandular hairs on the sepals, while the leaf stalks have a mixture of long and short hairs. As the English name suggests, this plant comes from France, from the Pyrenees. It was introduced to Britain in 1812 and first recorded in the wild nearly 100 years later in 1906. It is quite a frequent garden escape, as you can see on the distribution map. It's found in grassy places and waste ground, and it's definitely increased since the 1960s. Geranium versicolor, penciled cranesbill, is another large flowered perennial with pale lilac or white notched petals, and they have these distinctively darker violet veins that give it its name because it looks as though they've been penciled on. The petals also show this curving outwards at the top. Its leaves are not as deeply cut as those of French cranesbill, and this one doesn't have any glandular hairs. It comes from southern Europe and it does escape from gardens, but not as often as French cranesbill. It's commoner in the west and the south, and the Hertfordshire survey did find it in a few locations, including Harpenden Common. These two species can produce a fertile hybrid, Geranium cross oxonianum, Druce's cranesbill, which is commonly grown in gardens and also escapes. It was bred, but it also seems to occur naturally as a hybrid if both parents are present. The large flowers are pink, with the veins varying in intensity. This hybrid was first cultivated in Britain in 1932, and it's been recorded in the wild since 1954, so it only took it about 20 years to get over the garden wall. It could also persist as a garden outcast for a long time too. Another perennial, Geranium nodosum, knotted cranesbill, has flowers that, as you can see, look a bit like Druce's cranesbill. The violet veins aren't as prominent against background colour as in penciled cranesbill, but also more significantly for identification, the stems have this swelling at the nodes, which gives rise to the name. And you can just about see those here in this quite nice botanical illustration that I found. The other thing you can look for is the hairs lying flat along the surface of the stalk. This comes from the mountains of southern Europe, and it was imported into Britain in the early 17th century, so it's been around for a while. It was first recorded in the wild in 1801, and in the last London Flora, there were just 2 sites for it. The old garden at Worley Place, which some people might know, and that's probably where it probably had been planted there originally, and the other site was Banstead Heath. It can be found naturalised in hedgerows and woodland, but its records are very scattered. On the next slide. Yeah, so this map shows you the national picture. You can see it really is quite a scattered distribution. It also shows records from a few sites around the London area. Unlike several of the other cultivated geranium species, this one doesn't seem to be particularly increasing in the wild. So the last few plants that we've looked at were all neophytes, which means they were recent introductions. The next one is a native, and that's Geranium sylvaticum, wood cranesbill. It's quite a lot like our first plant, Meadow cranesbill, in its overall appearance, but it's much more a plant of northern England, though it's not restricted to woodland because it occurs in upland meadows, in hedge banks and on rocks as well. There are some key differences between wood and meadow cranesbill, just in case you need to distinguish them, because there are some places where their distribution overlaps. The leaf lobes are broader and the teeth on them are blunter and shallower, so they're only about twice as long as wide. In meadow cranesbill, they're about 3 times as long as wide, so definitely more kind of pointed. The petals are reddish or pinkish violet, obviously, rather than bluish. The flowers are a bit deeper, they're more cup-shaped than saucer-shaped. And the other thing is that the fruit stalks stay upright, they don't bend over. Here are the records for that in the London area. In its natural range, Geranium sylvaticum has certainly declined since the 1960s, and in particular the place it's really gone from is from hay meadows. That's largely due to the shift from hay to silage. When your hay is cut and dried, and it's often left in the field for a time, and flower seeds kind of tend to fall off and go back into the soil, silage gets fermented and stored in a silo. Also, silage production involves a very early cut of the grass, so it's cut in late May or early June, often cut again in July, and then possibly there's another cut. Also, what happens is fields are often heavily fertilised and more competitive grasses and clovers introduced, and all those kind of combine together to have a detrimental effect on wildflowers like wood cranesbill. Now, like meadow cranesbill, as well as being a native plant, wood cranesbill is also grown in gardens, though not as often, and may escape. And I suspect that's probably the source of the London area records. Next, we have Geranium sanguineum, bloody cranesbill, which is a short bushy perennial with deeply lobed and narrowly cut leaves, with stiff curved white hairs on both sides, and then these large solitary flowers. The petals are usually bright reddish purple. They don't they're sometimes a bit wavy at the edge, so they don't really have real notches, and the stems are abruptly bent. So that's the species where that particular feature you will find. The name refers not to the colour of the petals, but to the colour of the stalk joints. Incidentally, one thing that's quite interesting about this plant, it has a much higher chromosome count than nearly all the others. I haven't gone into any depth about chromosome numbers, but this one's quite interesting because it has 84 chromosomes compared to only 26 or 28 in most species. So it must be some kind of polyploid. As a native, it's found mainly on limestone rocks and calcareous sand dunes. But as Rodney Burton found in the London Flora, it has been planted in rock gardens and can grow vigorously and set good seed. So it's now much more frequent as a garden escape. It was found in a few locations in the Hertfordshire survey, including as a pavement weed. And then the only other plant in this subgenus that makes it into the illustrated wildflower books is Geranium columbinum, long-stalked cranesbill. This is a rather delicate looking annual with medium-sized rosy pink flowers on long slender stalks. That's particularly distinctive about it. They're up to 6 centimetres long. The leaves have almost linear lobes cut nearly to the base, so they look quite like those of cut-leaf cranesbill. But you can tell the two apart, not only from the length of the flower stalks, but because this plant doesn't have any glandular hairs. Instead, it has non-glandular ones, and they lie flat against the stalk. This too is a native plant, often considered fairly common on southern grassland and preferring thin, calcareous, chalky soils. But Trevor James noted a sharp decrease in Hertfordshire. This has happened on the national scale too. There's been widespread decline in both southeastern and northern England since the 1950s, and it's thought that's probably due to a combination again of habitat destruction, intensification of grassland management, including over-fertilisation and then weed killing on field margins, and also, on the other hand, unmanaged scrub overgrowth. Now, you may not all know this plant, but for those that do, we're going to have a little poll now because we like this audience participation. So, Kieran, if you're okay to put that first poll up, it's about whether you've seen long-stalked cranesbill and in the LNHS area, and you've got various locations to choose from. So if people have seen it, but really don't worry if you haven't, but if people have seen it, it would just be kind of useful to get a sense about where it has been seen. So I'm just going to give you 30 seconds or so just to have a go at that. Okay, if there's anybody else that I can see, a few people have seen it, so that's great. Okay, all right, so I'm going to assume that's everybody. Okay, because I see a lot of people haven't seen it, and that's not surprising because you may not know the plant, that's fine, but the fact you haven't seen it is probably reflective of the fact that there isn't very much of it about. And then I can see somebody's seen it sort of within the London boroughs area, and then we've got somebody who's seen that in Surrey and somebody who's seen it in Essex. So it's certainly true to say that if we could take the poll off now, it's certainly true to say that it's not particularly common. I'm just going to show you now. Can we take that off? Yeah. I'm just going to show you now the distribution. going to come. Yeah. So this was the distribution in the last London Flora. Just because that's kind of quite a useful reference, and that's basically showing you that there was already not very much of it. And if you think this is mainly looking at the distribution in the late 1960s, you can see already it was pretty rare in our area. So where it was found was Surrey, Kent, some records in Surrey and Kent, and then some records over here in Buckinghamshire. But it's not a common plant, and it may be we will see even less of it in the next London Flora. Now we've got a few rarer garden escapes to consider. The first one is Armenian cranesbill, which is these large flowers with magenta petals with a black base, very striking looking plant. It comes from the southwest Caucasus and northeast Turkey, and it's a common garden plant. You can see why gardens would like to grow it. It was first cultivated in Britain in 1874 and first recorded from the wild about 90 years later in 1966 in Eastern Ross in Scotland, and you can see the scattered records on the distribution map. Stace also does mention another similar species. I'm just going to mention that just so we're covering everything. Geranium precurans, which comes from the Himalayas. The flowers are similar in colour, but they're even larger than these ones, up to 3.5 centimetres across. That plant has long trailing stems which root at the nodes, and it has already been getting out of gardens onto adjacent banks in Scotland and Wales. Unfortunately, I don't have an image of the next plant, but I can tell you it looks quite like our old friend Meadow cranesbill, and it may be mistaken for it. So Geranium himalayense, Himalayan cranesbill, has large blue to violet blue flowers, and you would need to look at the less deeply lobed leaves with blunter teeth to tell it apart from meadow cranesbill, and then the flower colour would distinguish it from wood cranesbill, which has got quite similar leaves. This has been grown in gardens since the 1880s, but was only recorded in the wild in 1976, and it was recorded first in West Kent. I'm wondering whether it possibly wasn't distinguished from meadow cranesbill until then. Another complication is that there's a hybrid between Himalayan and meadow cranesbill. It's a sterile hybrid, and again, I understand this is something that's deliberately been bred rather than something that occurs naturally, and it's known as Johnson's Blue, Geranium cross Johnsoni, and it too may get mistaken for meadow cranesbill. There are certainly very few records of it, as you can see, that those are the only ones I've kind of just honed in on where the records actually are. It's because it doesn't produce fertile seed, that probably is one of the reasons why it rarely escapes, and that's probably an explanation for how few records there are, because it is quite popular in gardens. Alderney cranesbill comes from South America. Again, I don't have a picture of that, but it's another perennial, this time with small pink flowers and deeply lobed leaves. It's got no glandular hairs, it's got mericarps that are hairy. This is a plant that's been found naturalised in Guernsey since 1926, Alderney since 1938, and it's pretty much restricted to there. Geranium ibericum, Caucasian cranesbill, is another one with those large violet blue flowers, and it's got leaves with lots of lobes, about 9 to 11 lobes. Again, this has been a garden plant since 1802, but only occurs very rarely as a naturalised plant. It was first recorded in the wild in the 1920s when it was found in eastern Sutherland. It may be confused with the next species and with the hybrid between them. So the way you would distinguish those is by looking at the depth of the leaf lobes, that's one way, and then a better feature to look at the relative number of glandular and non-glandular hairs. So this particular one, Geranium ibericum, has no glandular hairs at all. Geranium platypetalum, glandular cranesbill, the name kind of gives you a hint. It has lots of glandular hairs. It also comes from the Caucasus region, so that's north of Turkey, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and southwest Russia. It's got these violet blue flowers, and the other thing that's distinctive about them is they have this sort of pointing sideways, the way they're held on the plant. For a time, this was only known naturalised in one site in Dunbartonshire, where it was found in the 1980s. But it has now been seen in southwest Yorkshire and Flintshire. There is a late 20th century record on the BSBI database from Little Kimble near Aylesbury in Buckinghamshire, but I'm really not sure of its status. So if anybody actually knows anything about that, I'd be quite interested. I suspect it's probably been decided that it was growing in the garden. Stace certainly doesn't mention it, and I'm sure he would if it was a genuine record. Now, those two plants were crossed to give this sterile hybrid, Geranium cross magnificum, purple cranesbill, which has, again, large purplish violet flowers. Again, another popular plant, and it spreads really vigorously. It was first recorded in our neck of the woods in the wild in 1932 in Middlesex, and this is probably one that's increasing. You can see it's quite widely distributed. Again, this may be confused with meadow cranesbill, but the one thing that will really tell you the difference is that the fact that these petals are really conspicuously notched. They're also more purplish. You can also look for reddish colouring near the base of the leaf stalks, and this one has a roughly equal mixture of glandular and non-glandular hairs, and those features will all help you with the identification. So we now must press on to the Robertium subgenus. Remember, these are the ones where the petal has a distinctive claw. And again, we've got several common plants to start with. Geranium molle, dove's foot cranesbill, Geranium pusillum, small flowered cranesbill, Geranium Robertianum, Herb-Robert, Geranium pyrenaicum, hedgerow cranesbill, and Geranium lucidum, shining cranesbill. So Geranium molle, dove's foot cranesbill. This is a very common native annual, particularly in established neutral grassland, and its distribution now is largely the same as it was in the 1960s, so it's pretty stable. It's one I like to teach the children and the staff at the school where I work. They like the English name, which comes from the soft greyish appearance, and it grows profusely on our lawns there. It's got rounded lobed leaves and small flowers, and its petals are pink and notched. There are some key features to look for in this species. First, you'd look at the stems. These will have long hairs, 1 to 2 millimeters long, and they're visible really even to the naked eye, but certainly seen better with a hand lens. There are also short hairs, some of which have glands. Then you'd look at the stamens, and all 10 of them will have pink anthers. Now, those features are going to probably be sufficient for identification, but if you do want to have a look at the mericarps, you'll find they're hairless and usually ridged. In passing, I'm just going to mention very briefly a rare garden escape noted by Stace called Geranium brutium. And apparently this looks quite like dove's foot cranesbill, but the leaves are greener and the petals are longer. You won't be very likely to find that, but the plant beginner botanists will need to learn to distinguish from dove's foot cranesbill is another native, Geranium pusillum, small flowered cranesbill. The flowers of this annual are a bit smaller and they're usually a pale, dingy lilac colour, but that colour difference is not entirely reliable. Better for identification are 2 other features. So first, if you look closely, you will see that 5 of the 10 stamens don't have any anthers. Then you would look at the hairs on the stalks, which are quite different. So notice the uniform short and non-glandular hairs of small flowered cranesbill on the right, which are arranged like roof tiles. You'd also find the mericarps, if you looked at those, are different because they're downy and they haven't got any ridges. Small flowered cranesbill is common in eastern England in dry, short grassland, and Trevor James found that it was increasing in Hertfordshire as it colonised new road banks, the land around abandoned gravel pits, and thin lawns on gravel. Anecdotally, it seems to have been steadily increasing in London too. Certainly it wasn't widely recorded in the last London flora, and you can see that distribution map here, and there's certainly a very few central and not very many North London records. The third plant in this group is Geranium Robertianum, Herb-Robert, and this native plant probably needs no introduction to most of you. It's found everywhere in a range of habitats, and it was one of the first plants I learned to identify myself as a child. It's a hairy annual with medium-sized flowers and unnotched petals. The stems are often reddish, and if you look at the leaf stalks, you'll see red-tipped glandular hairs. Its most distinctive features are the pinnately cut leaflets, the orange or purple anthers, which produce orange pollen, and the strong smell. So now we've come to our final poll of the evening. Kieran, if you could set that up for us, and it's basically about the smell of Herb-Robert. So you've got another number of choices. Do you think Herb-Robert smells like, and you can just choose one of those. If you're kind of pretty confident, you go for that. If you're not sure, you can go for that. If you just want to have a wild guess, that's fine as well. So just give you a few minutes to just have a try. Okay, and please, it really doesn't matter. There's no prize for getting it right or not right. So it just kind of like be fun to just see what people think. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Right, so I can see a lot of you have gone for not sure, which is obviously the safest option, but well done for everybody else for plump for something. I like this. Carrots is obviously quite a popular choice, so that's great. And then we've got a sort of like a few people have gone for the different kind of animal smells, cats, foxes, and mice. And now, in fact, Herb-Robert is sometimes known as stinking Bob, which suggests it might not smell particularly nice. So anybody went for a kind of nice smell. I can see no one chose the chocolate, so that it definitely doesn't smell like chocolate. I think the general consensus, and I've kind of particularly gone with Richard Maybe here, is that it's acrid and mouse-like, like a smell of mouse. So I think that would be pretty good, but cat and fox are not too far off either. So I'm going to go for mouse, but it's got quite a distinctive, quite an unpleasant smell, and smells are notoriously difficult to describe, so it's quite hard to pin them down. So thank you for that. I'm just going to close that there. Once you've had a sniff, it's mericarps. You can have a look at those. They're slightly ridged and they have very few hairs, if any. Now, of all the plants in this genus, this seems to be the only one with any folklore associated with it, even though we've got quite a lot of native plants. I did mention Herb-Robert in my newsletter article, which some of you might have read. Robert may be a corruption of red because of the reddish tinge to the plant, but the plant is also associated with the German sprite Nest Rupert, who apparently leaves bad children a lump of coal at Christmas, and with his mischievous British equivalent, Robin Goodfellow, or Pup, probably just because of how ubiquitous it is. Some authors distinguish various subspecies of this plant, but the validity of that is a bit disputed, and we're not going to go there today. But certainly it's worth mentioning it's a very variable species. There is a garden-grown variety, album, which has white flowers, and some of you may know this. Instead, we're going to turn to Geranium pyrenaicum, hedgerow cranesbill, which is rather like a large dove's foot cranesbill. But it's a perennial with markedly larger flowers that are usually dull purple and with deeply notched petals. The mericarps are hairy and smooth, unlike the ridge ones of dove's foot cranesbill. So that's a way that you could distinguish them on the mericarps. This comes originally from the mountains of southern Europe, and it's now common in southeast England in rough grassy places. It was first recorded in Britain in 1762 and has been gradually increasing since then. So in Hampshire, it was still described as a very rare plant in the late 19th century, but it's now widespread. You can see the distribution there. The only other common plant in this group is Geranium lucidum, shining cranesbill. This annual has bright, glossy green, rounded leaves, often tinged with red, and it's got a habit of growing on cobbled paths and walls. It's an almost hairless plant with medium-sized pink flowers with unnotched petals. The sepals are worth looking at. They're keeled like little boats. Shining cranesbill is a native plant, but it also occurs in places in southern England as a garden escape, and indeed it can actually be invasive. Since the 1960s, it's expanded its range, and it also occurs in a lot more 10-kilometre squares. Then we've got two other species that are frequent enough to be included in the Collins Wildflower Guide. These are Geranium macrorhizum, rock cranesbill, and Geranium purpureum, little robin. Geranium macrorhizum is a perennial with tiny sticky glandular hairs and glands, and it's another one with a distinctive smell. Now, Poland describes it as cat-scented and maybe as almost peppermint-scented, and I don't think cats and peppermint smell that similar, so you can make up your own mind what you think it smells like. But anyway, it's definitely got a distinctive smell. Also useful for identification are the hairless mericarps, and they have these quite distinctive sharp horizontal ridges near the tip. It was introduced into Britain by 1576, having come from the mountains of southern Europe and the Balkans. It's been known in the wild since 1835, and it's probably another one that's increasing in the wild. You can see it's really quite widely distributed. It doesn't occur always as a garden escape. It's not one that gets out of the garden most readily, but it's certainly very persistent once it's established. Rodney Burton's Flora records it as established at Enfield, and it seems to be that there it had escaped from Edward Bowles's garden. That's a garden some of you may know. Little Robin is a native, and it looks rather like Herb-Robert. It's a bit like a younger brother. It's got smaller leaves, smaller flowers, and then the other distinctive thing about it, and you can see that quite nicely here, it's got yellow anthers and yellow pollen. It's also, if you looked at the mericarps, they're more ridged and the leaflets are hairless. This grows on stony soils, shingle and railway ballast, but it's not a very common plant, and there's sometimes it's actually recorded in error for the very variable Herb-Robert. Since the 1960s, little robin has been lost from some of the outlying areas in its range, but interestingly, in Cornwall, its numbers have increased since the mid-1970s. Possibly it's benefited from modern road verge management, which kind of cuts things back and leaves things more open for it, and possibly also from milder winters. Now, there is a hybrid between Herb-Robert and little robin, Geranium robertianum cross purpureum. It's an endemic, so it means it's found only here. It occurs occasionally in Ireland and also in southwest England on maritime shingle, where both parents grow. Now we're back to some garden escapes. Dalmatian cranesbill is described in Stace 4, the latest edition, though it wasn't in the previous one. It's a mat-forming aromatic perennial with glossy green leaves. The flowers are large and light pink. This plant comes again from the Western Balkans, and it's now found on walls and banks near gardens, so it's getting out again. Its hybrid with rock cranesbill is Geranium cross cantabrigiense, Cambridge cranesbill. This was developed in 1974 by Helen Kiefer of the Cambridge University Botanic Gardens, and that gardens has had quite a lot to do with geraniums over the years. It's intermediate in appearance, and it's got seeds which do not ripen, so it's a sterile hybrid. Also distinctive about this is there are curled hairs on the top of the leaves and on the petiole. It's fairly rare in the wild, but it has been recorded in several locations around London. Now, presumably as it's a sterile hybrid, it's either vegetative spread from gardens or possibly persistent throwouts. Now we've got 3 Herb-Robert type species to finish off this group. Greater Herb-Robert comes from Madeira and it occasionally naturalises. Its specific name comes from the botanist Peter Yeo, and I'm going to mention him briefly at the end. Flowers, leaves, petioles and fruits are all larger than in Geranium robertianum, and its mericarps have a much denser network of ridges. There are also often curled hairs along the veins on the top of the leaves. Now, this was first cultivated in Britain as far back as 1778, but it isn't widely planted. I suspect it looks a bit too much like the weed Herb-Robert for many gardeners to go for it. It was recorded from the wild in the 1930s on the Isle of Man. You can see on there, you can see it's still kind of found there. It's been naturalised on Guernsey since 1968, and there are a few other scattered records. Now, as its name suggests, Canary Herb-Robert, Geranium ruteri, comes from the Canaries. It's got a number of distinctive features. The mid-lobes of its leaves have no stalk. You can see that really nicely in the picture on the right. The styles are white. The stamens are much longer than the sepals. You can see the length of them in the picture on the left, and the base of the petal is lighter than the rest. This one is found naturalised in a few sites in Cornwall, as well as in Guernsey and in County Wexford. Then, Geranium madeirense giant Herb-Robert is by far and away the largest species in the whole genus. So if you want to see a big geranium, this is the one for you. It's a perennial which is 1 to 2 metres tall, with stems up to 5 centimetres thick. The petioles, the leaf stalks, over 30 centimetres long, and the flowers are 3 centimetres wide or more. This escape is now well naturalised and increasing on the cliffs in Scilly, as well as in Cornwall and the Channel Islands. Though it looks spectacular in a garden, it's potentially problematic in the wild, I would have thought, although I hadn't done an internet search and I haven't found yet any evidence of concern about it, just people writing about how nice it looks on the cliffs. So I'd be interested if there is any evidence of concern about it being invasive. It was only introduced into cultivation in Britain in around 1950, having come, like Greater Herb-Robert, from Madeira. And it was first recorded from the wild just 28 years later in Guernsey, so again, quite far spread out of the garden. It is sensitive to frost, so that will limit any invasive potential it does have. So you'll be pleased to know we're nearly at the end of the talk, so hang on in there. In the final subgenus, Erodioidea, that's the one with the pointed mericarps, we only need to concern ourselves with 1 species and 1 hybrid. Geranium phaeum, dusky cranesbill, is a perennial with very distinctive medium-sized flowers. They're blackish purple in colour. That's an unusual colour in the plant world, and they have these pointed petals which are bent backwards. Other features which help identify are the red spotted stems and the leaves with 7 broad lobes which often have a black blotch. This plant was introduced into gardens from the Central European mountains and now occurs as an escape more in the south and the west. It's been known in the wild since 1724, for so a long time. Its national distribution in 2000 seemed to be similar to that in the 1962 atlas, but Trevor James thought it was becoming rarer in Hertfordshire, despite the existence of some long-standing colonies. So that's one I'll be interested to see what the distribution is looking like now in London. It's also known as Mourning Widow, both because of its colour and because it likes damp, shady graveyards. Like some of the other species we've covered, dusky cranesbill does have many named cultivars, and some of these have been reported from the wild. And then just to complicate matters, to finish off with, it has been interbred to form a partially fertile hybrid with yet another species, Geranium reflexum. This too was bred at Cambridge Botanic Garden. The hybrid is Munich cranesbill, and although I haven't got a picture, it can be told apart from dusky cranesbill by its much narrower and more reflexed petals, which are pinkish mauve, and they've also got more hairs at the base. It is known from counties near London, so you may come across it. It was first recorded in the wild in Berkshire at the end of the 19th century, and it was found again in 1975 in Hurst Green, East Sussex, and that became quite a famous little colony. So I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to the genus Geranium. I've certainly enjoyed learning more about these plants, and I'm the first to admit I'm no great expert, and I'm sure there are more knowledgeable people in the audience. But I am happy to hear any comments or try to answer any questions you may have. Just before I do that, I just want to point out this book by Peter Yeo, which is currently out of print. Unfortunately, I don't have a copy, but it is an excellent guide to the geraniums grown in gardens and to the genus as a whole, if people want something specifically on this genus. Peter Yeo was a taxonomist at Cambridge Botanic Garden for 40 years, and he did an incredible amount of work on geranium taxonomy. So thanks very much for listening, and I'm going to hand you back now to David.
Thanks, Maria. That was really fascinating. There's a huge amount there to learn and to know, and I suspect lots of us will be referring back to this video on YouTube to learn things. I'm not seeing any virtual hands raised. So, Kieran, have you had any questions posted in the chat that you'd?
Yeah, I've got a few for you. So, right, Maria, are you ready?
Okay. We'll give it a go, and yeah.
So the first question is from Linda, and Linda's asked, do the flowering or fruiting timings vary between the species?
I certainly think there's some variation, and I haven't looked. I don't have that, kind of like in detail. I mean, something like Herb-Robert pretty much flowers all year round. Yeah, so there's pretty much not many times in the year when you won't find that in flower. And also things like Geranium pusillum, Geranium molle, again, they seem to have quite long flowering seasons. I think some of the and even some of the garden, obviously they tend to be mainly summer flowering, but they again can flower for quite long periods of time, sort of from certainly early summer through into the autumn. So there is some variation, and that's maybe something I can kind of go into another time. But I also think there's quite a lot of overlap. So I don't think you can necessarily see a particular pattern where you say, if you find this in flower at this time of the year, therefore it's pretty much going to be that. But they are, I think, generally, and one of the reasons why they are quite popular in gardens is because they do flower, they spread nicely, and they flower for relatively long periods of time.
Okay. The next question is from Sophia, and she's asking, is LNHS doing anything about the depleted geranium flowers? So I think she means the ones that are not doing so well in London.
I mean, obviously, we're an organisation that is mostly about recording rather than actually doing something. I think basically people are looking at the ones that are responding to habitat destruction. One of the issues obviously is the kind of switching over from the traditional ways of managing hay fields and the switch over to silage, and that's a very difficult problem to start to address, because that's a whole agricultural approach. I mean, I think obviously people are looking at things like the field margins and trying to kind of encourage people to leave those and have set aside that kind of thing. So I think I don't think at the moment any of them are considered top priority species in terms of something needs to be done about them. But I think, you know, they would certainly, obviously, some of them benefit from thinking about a more traditional kind of management of meadows. And I think there is a, you know, there is generally an interest in the kind of conservation world as a whole in trying to get those, at least some of those meadows managed in a more traditional way, and that one will, you know, benefit not just some of the cranesbills but some of the other plants as well.
I think it's fair to say that LNHS's contribution is to get out there recording flowers so that the evidence is there for other organisations like London Wildlife Trust, for example, to then take conservation action.
Yeah.
So Kat has asked if you can tell us anything about the roots which seem to spread out a lot.
About the roots, as the ones that are growing, they're growing. Yeah, they do spread out a lot. So yeah, essentially, a lot of these plants are, you know, they kind of got two ways of spreading effectively. They've got this explosive spreading of the seeds, which is, you know, a good way of spreading themselves around. They also, you know, spread vegetatively, so they're good at kind of like, you know, going at a good pace underneath the ground and then popping up all over the place. And that's one of the other reasons why they're popular in gardens, because they will spread. I don't know anything more about I mean, some of them, obviously the perennial ones are you know, are going to have rooting systems where they've got, you know, rhizomes and they've got, you know, underground storage. So but I don't know whether that's enough about roots or there's something else particular that. Yeah, that's as much as I know about the roots.
All right, can I just sort of ask you, when I dig out lots of Herb-Robert, well, I don't even dig it out, you just pull it out.
Yes,
yeah. It's almost like a spidery root system. It doesn't come up from one central, well, it probably does in the first place come up from one, but it seems to be spidery. Is that because it's spreading?
I mean, that's the sort of, because that one is an annual or at the most a biennial, so it's not a perennial where it kind of will build up a big extensive root system. So basically, it's spreading itself around in a sort of spidery, feathery way, just as many nutrients as it can, and it's growing very quickly because it's got to complete its life cycle within the year, or sometimes it does last over into a second year. So it's just I don't think it's anything particularly about it's probably more the nature of the habitat in which it grows rather than anything particularly about it being a geranium.
It's certainly different from any other root system I've seen. Any other rooting.
Okay, that's interesting. I'll that's something I'll look into a bit more then, because I haven't read anything that suggests it's got a particularly unusual growth form. But something I'll need to kind of like look into a bit more, I think, because I'm intrigued now. I want to go and pull one up. Which so I will do that.
So I'm conscious of time. And Kieran said he's got two more questions from people. If we take them quite quickly.
They're both from Sophia, Maria, and I've got a feeling that you might not be able to answer these, but I might be underestimating you, because they're a bit more about, they're not really about ID. But the two questions are, first of all, are you aware of geraniums being used for medicinal purposes at all? And the second question from Sophia is, why are geraniums so leafy with few flowers?
Okay, medicinally, it's not something I particularly looked into. Richard maybe quite often points things out, and he didn't. I suspect they're not particularly used, although it's quite interesting that some of them are aromatic, and so that makes me think there must be interesting chemicals in them. I've read about Herb-Robert producing allelopathic chemicals, which will kind of dampen down the growth of other plants nearby. So again, that suggests there's something interesting chemically, but anything more than that, it's not something that I've looked at. I've really concentrated on ID at the moment, but again, that's something I could kind of look into. Leafy, I'm guessing they do have quite a lot of flowers, and it might just depend which pictures you see and what time of the year you're taking them. So I wouldn't say they have an awful lot of leaf compared to flower, but obviously the more leaves it can produce, the more it can photosynthesize, and it obviously wants to have a good, and the fact that it goes for this kind of like wide coverage. So yeah, I don't know if I can kind of say more than that about them, really.
I think maybe it's a case of get that book and read further for people then. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I'm conscious we're just beyond 7:30, and I did say we would finish on time to let people get back lives. So just to start, just to say thank you to Maria again.